Joining me today in the Capital TV show, Victoria Coates. She's a former Deputy National Security Advisor. Ms. Coates, how are you? Good evening.
I'm very well. Thank you for having me on.
Can we discuss the causes of the recent conflict between Israel and Palestine, from ineffective governance on each side to the end of Israeli isolationism to undue escalation by Hamas? How do you think about the situation in Gaza right now?
I think the situation in Gaza is an absolutely tragic situation, particularly for the Palestinians in Gaza, who are basically being held hostage by Hamas, which is being controlled by Tehran. And so you have millions of innocent people who are completely stuck in a conflict that really is not of their choosing. And I think it is no accident that Hamas has chosen this moment to unleash this barrage of rockets, which were supplied to them by Iran.
Mm-hmm. Can we know who is the beneficiary of this situation?
Well, I think ultimately Hamas and the Iranians. I mean, Hamas is managing to make themselves much more than a nuisance, and the Iranians are testing the new Biden administration to see if their commitment to Israel is as strong as the previous administration.
Ms. Coates, David Friedman, former U.S. ambassador to Israel, says ace reporters at the Associated Press seem to have missed the fact that Hamas was operating in their building. And do you think that this is going to be a big deal for Israel because they target the press, a building with office of Al Jazeera and Associated Press? Do you think this is going to be a big deal against Israel?
Well, I think it is a very serious decision that they made to target that building. But Maria, as I'm sure you know, I mean, Hamas is so embedded into the infrastructure of Gaza. You know, one of the most significant buildings is a hospital, but Hamas put their headquarters in the basement, essentially using a hospital as a human shield for their activities. And I think they were doing exactly the same thing with the tower. They thought that the presence, particularly of the Associated Press, would give them immunity in essence. And I think, you know, the Israeli sort of tactics in the lead up to the strike, obviously everyone was warned. There was nobody in the building. There was a knock. You know, they have no interest in hurting anybody from the AP or from Al Jazeera. But if they're going to finally take care of Hamas, so we're not back here doing the same thing in 5-6 years, they're going to have to hit some of this infrastructure.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke with Egyptian Foreign Minister Shukri to discuss the ongoing violence in Israel, West Bank, and Gaza. Can the Egyptian mediation reach a conclusion in ceasefire after also an Egyptian delegation went to Tel Aviv, arrives there as a mediator?
Yes, I think Egypt can play an extremely positive role here, and Foreign Minister Shukri is a good friend. He is one of the wisest and most experienced diplomats in the region. And I think his involvement is a very good sign. And obviously, Egypt has had relations with Israel since 1979. Those ties are warming. A little noted good news story from earlier this year was that the Petroleum Minister Al-Mullah paid his first visit to Jerusalem. You might have thought that was standard, but it wasn't. And so this was a very big deal to bring him together with Minister Steinitz on the Israeli side. And they signed a historic gas deal to export Israeli gas through the Egyptian facilities at Alexandria, a very big deal. So Egypt is and can play an extremely positive role in mediating this. Obviously, Hamas will listen to them, hopefully, more than they listen to the Iranians, and the Egyptians can really make the case for the people of Gaza.
Mm-hmm. It is often observed that if the Israelis were to lay down their guns, Israel would be destroyed. But if the Palestinians were to lay down their guns, there would be peace. What is the meaning of this sentence?
Well, I think it has a lot of truth in it. That the Israelis have no interest in conflict at this point. Israel has a lot of interest in technological development and recovery from the pandemic, in developing new sources of energy. The country has an enormous amount of potential, which it has been realizing. And one of the great keys to that potential are the Abraham Accords reached last year between Israel, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. And what those accords demonstrated is that the sort of traditional wisdom that you had to come to a Palestinian deal before you could have those kinds of peace deals was incorrect. And it really demonstrated that following Egypt and Jordan, others in the Arab world would rather see peace with Israel than conflict, and all the enormous potential that that represents. So my question then for Palestinian leadership, and I think unfortunately President Abbas's canceling of the elections that were to happen actually this week demonstrates that that political process is broken. But to reasonable Palestinians who just want a better life for themselves and for their children, what is your end game here? What do you want to achieve? Because that long lie that the Arabs were going to come charging over the River Jordan and destroy Israel and establish some sort of Palestinian state, that's a lie. That's not happening. Very, very, very clearly. So what you've been sold all these many years, that if you just suffer long enough, this is going to happen. This is demonstrably untrue. And I know that's an unpleasant reality for many, but at the same time, I think it can be freeing. And, it'd be my hope that the new administration, interested members of Congress, would engage very closely with the Palestinians to try to build some new institutions so they can realize a brighter future.
What do you think about rewarding Gaza? The Biden administration is rewarding Gaza and the West Bank with $10 million in new aid in the midst of Palestinian terror attacks on Israel. And at the same time, Biden said that Israel has the right to defend itself. So is there any contradiction, or what you can see from this administration? What do you expect from this administration to resolve this problem?
I think you really identified a serious sort of conflict within the administration's policies so far. It was the Trump administration's policies that while the Palestinians engaged in sort of toxic, noxious practices like paying terrorists to kill Israelis and also engaging in very hostile anti-American rhetoric, that it is against our laws for us to give them American taxpayer dollars. So I think by going back into what were the failed policies of the past, the unconditional support for UNRWA, the sort of glossing over of the anti-American rhetoric, the Biden administration has gotten itself into a conflict. And as for Israel's right for self-defense, of course, Israel has a right for self-defense. So Palestinians have a right to defend themselves. But this goes farther than that. I think that Israel, in this case, given the severity of the attacks, has an obligation to defend its sovereignty. I mean, this is an attack on Israel's existence. And so I think the administration could be much more forward-leaning in terms of supporting that and understanding that if we were in a similar position and the Canadians and the Mexicans were raining rockets down on us, we wouldn't act with a huge amount of restraint either.
You said in your article at the National Review, events in Israel this week are similar to what occurred in the summer 2014. The Iranian regime, buoyed by its engagement with the Obama administration, empowered and encouraged its terrorist proxy Hamas to attack Israel from Gaza, so it could go the U.S. response. So what is the similar condition between now and 2014, and what is the relation between the negotiation in Vienna? Is there any relation in this matter?
Well, I think in the minds of the Iranian regime, there's a very close relationship. I think they see Israel as their primary foe in the region, along with Saudi Arabia, which is an interesting combination. But and they are wanting to test whether the Americans are going to be very serious about Israel's defense. And I think in the summer of 2014, as they were beginning the JCPOA negotiations, they wanted to test that. And they got the answer that they wanted, which is the Obama administration allowed plenty of daylight between the US and Israel with the really shocking decision to slow walk the request for Hellfires. And I would just remind your viewers that Hellfires are precision missiles. If you want to avoid civilian casualties, precision armaments are the way to go, because you obviously have much less of a chance for accident.
Mm.
are misfire. So, the withholding of the hellfires was really, I think, a counterproductive decision on a whole host of fronts. And so, I think, since we're in a very similar situation now, for members of Congress in particular to clarify to the administration that they're not going to stand for any such shenanigans in this case, and particularly in terms of the Iron Dome interceptors, which have been so very heavily used. Now, they're an Israeli product. It's a Rafael product, but the United States can always commit additional funding for that resupply and do everything we can to help expedite it. And I think that would be a very important signal to send. Unfortunately, the White House press secretary on Friday refused to commit to that kind of support. So I am very concerned that we might be headed into a similar situation.
So there is an impact of tensions on the future of negotiations. So do you see that Biden will take a decision by withdrawing of his intention to go back to the nuclear JCPOA?
No, I don't. I think, as I said, I think for the Iranians, these issues are linked. I think for the administration, they're trying to keep them very separate, so that the nuclear deal for them is almost an article of faith. It's something they believe in so strongly that I think they would bargain pretty much anything away in order to get back into the deal.
You said also, you conclude that the Congress can continue leading support for the US-Israeli alliance. Don't you think that sometimes they will blame the Jews or the Israeli lobby in the USA by creating problems for this administration? If we can, this is a crazy thought, but what do you think about it?
Well, I think that's a very easy kind of excuse to blame the Israel lobby. But I think you can't actually ascribe any particular lobby that kind of power. I think the support for Israel and for the US-Israel alliance across the country is very, very strong. And there are a number of cases of that where the American people understand who our friends are. They understand that Egypt's our friend. They understand that Saudi Arabia is our friend. And they understand that the Iranians are not. I'm old enough to remember 1979. And, when you think back to that year, that terrible year, and the new Iranian regime taking 52 Americans hostage for more than a year, people don't forget about that. And one of the other things I mentioned in the piece is that in February, there was a vote in the Senate about the location of the US Embassy in Israel, and they voted 97-3 to keep the embassy in Jerusalem. And, to have, you might have noticed our politics is a little hot right now in Washington, but to have that kind of bipartisan support means that, 97 senators think that their constituents want this policy. As I said, no lobby can achieve that. That's the American people speaking through their elected representatives.
How do you look at the role of UAE by hosting a meeting for Arab parliaments to discuss the conflict and to end and to make a ceasefire? So, is UAE can do anything? Because it's a country who signed the Abraham Accord. So is there any role can the UAE leaders do in this matter?
Oh, I think absolutely. And I would hope the King of Morocco would also consider playing a role along with Bahrain. And I think what they can offer is, again, a mediating role. They've obviously, the UAE has been a very significant financial supporter of the Palestinian people. I know they are intensely frustrated, and I saw with great interest Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed's statement late last week, basically calling out both sides. Historically, that would not have been the case. Historically, it would have been a statement very powerfully anti-Israel and very powerfully pro-Palestinian. But the leadership in UAE is very clearly fed up with Hamas. They want to continue the warming of ties with Israel. They see all the enormous economic and security benefits that holds. And so I think for the first time, they're not giving the Palestinians, and especially Hamas, a free pass here. So I think they can also be voices of reason to try to bring the Palestinian side to the table and negotiate in good faith some sort of lasting agreement with Israel.
Mm-hmm. Victoria Coates, the former Deputy National Security Advisor, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely, Maria. Thank you.